6:47 a.m. Daniel Reyes stood at the loading dock behind Fenwick Market, breath fogging in the cold, checking the same crate twice because his hands were faster than his mind that early. A rubber band snapped around his wrist. 3 flicks, always 3, a habit nobody had ever asked him to explain. Today, the 3rd flick didn't come. His phone buzzed instead. A text from his daughter's school. "Miss Doyle would like to speak with you about Sophie today, before 3 p.m. He didn't know yet that in 6 hours, a stranger in a wheelchair would look at him like he was the first honest thing to enter that house in 17 years. He didn't know yet that a name from his old life, a name he had buried under grocery bags and delivery routes, was about to be dug back up in front of people who had never once used it kindly. He loaded the van. 11 stops. The 9th was a house on Ash Grove Hill he'd never delivered to before, a name on the manifest he almost recognized and told himself he didn't. He didn't like Ash Grove Hill. Big gates, long driveways, dogs that barked at delivery vans like they were an insult to the property. But a stop was a stop, and Sophie's shoes were getting small at the toe again, and there was rent, and there was the quiet arithmetic that ran under everything Daniel Reyes did now, the arithmetic of a man who had once been paid to heal people and now was paid to carry their milk to the door. He climbed back into the van. The rubber band was still loose around his wrist. He didn't flick it a 3rd time. He drove. Daniel was 38, and if you'd told him at 30 he'd be delivering groceries for $11 an hour plus tips, he would have laughed the way people laugh at things that can never happen to them. He had been a physical therapist once, a good one, the kind other therapists sent their hardest cases to, the kind who could look at the way a person favored their left hip and tell you what year the injury happened. He had a certificate on a wall that didn't exist anymore, in an apartment that didn't exist anymore, from a marriage that ended not in divorce, but in the quietest, cruelest way a marriage can end. His wife Mara had been in a car accident 4 years ago. Not catastrophic, a shattered pelvis, a long but survivable recovery, the kind of injury physical therapists like Daniel treated every week without losing sleep over. Except her insurance company had capped her covered sessions at 14, and the clinic where Daniel worked told him, not asked him, to sign off on her discharge at session 12 to keep the numbers clean for an audit. He fought it. He lost. Mara went home 2 sessions early, tried to do too much too soon on a hip that wasn't ready, and fell down 4 porch steps reaching for a dropped phone. The 2nd injury was the one that mattered. The bleed was slow, and no one caught it until it was too late to matter. She never woke up. Daniel didn't blame the insurance company, not really, not out loud. He blamed the 12-session form with his own signature on it. He quit therapy work within the month. He told himself it was grief. 3 years later, he understood it was something closer to penance. He had stopped trusting his own hands to know when a body was ready, so he'd chosen a job where the only thing he had to know was which house needed the oat milk.
He raised Sophie alone. She was 8 now, gap-toothed, endlessly serious about the wrong things and endlessly light about the right ones. She still asked some nights why Daddy didn't fix people anymore. He always changed the subject before he had to answer honestly. The note from school worried him more than he let on. Sophie didn't get in trouble. She got quiet, which was worse. He called the school from the van between stops 7 and 8, got the teacher's voicemail, left a message in the careful, unhurried voice he used for anything involving his daughter, a voice that cost him more effort than anyone would ever know. He pulled up to stop 9 at 11:20 a.m. The gate at 14 Ashgrove Hill was already open, which struck him as strange, and there was a black SUV parked crooked in the circular drive, engine running, like someone had left in a hurry or arrived in one. The order was 3 crates, mostly soft foods, protein shakes, the kind of grocery list Daniel had seen 100 times in his old career and recognized instantly for what it was. Someone in that house couldn't chew well, or didn't have the energy to, or both. A woman in scrubs opened the door before he knocked, phone pinned between shoulder and ear, waving him toward the kitchen without really looking at him. "Just leave it on the counter, thanks," she said, already turning away mid-sentence to whoever was on the call. Daniel carried the first crate in. That was when he saw the man in the wheelchair at the end of the hallway, framed by a window with the curtains half drawn, sitting so still that for one confused second Daniel thought he was looking at a photograph. The man's name, Daniel would learn within the hour, was Arthur Whitfield. 17 years ago, he had built a mid-size furniture company out of a garage and turned it into something with his name on delivery trucks across 4 states. 12 years ago, a fall from a warehouse mezzanine had crushed 2 vertebrae and, according to every doctor who'd examined him since, ended any possibility of him ever standing again. He accepted that verdict the way a man accepts weather. He no longer fought it. He barely spoke about it. What Arthur Whitfield did mostly was watch. And what he watched as Daniel set the crate down and instinctively, habitually, the way old training never fully leaves a body, was a flicker of something crossing the delivery driver's face that no one had shown Arthur Whitfield in a very long time. Not pity, recognition. "You're staring at my foot," Arthur said. His voice was dry, unbothered, a man long past what strangers thought.
Daniel realized he'd been caught and felt his neck go warm. "Sorry, force of habit." What kind of habit stares at a paralyzed man's foot? Daniel should have said nothing. He had trained himself for 3 years to say nothing, to be a man who carried groceries and asked no questions and made no observations about anyone's body ever again. But the foot was turned in a way that made no clinical sense for the diagnosis printed, he'd bet, somewhere in a folder in this house. A subtle, involuntary inward rotation that only happened when certain muscles were still, against all odds, receiving signal. "Old habit," Daniel said instead, and picked up the second crate and left it at that, because it was not his business, because he had learned the hard way what happened when he let himself believe his hands still knew things. But Arthur Whitfield, who noticed everything because there was little else left for him to do, noticed that the delivery driver's hands had not been idle. They had been doing something Arthur hadn't felt directed at him in 12 years. They had been assessing him. The scrubs nurse, her name was Priya, Daniel would learn, a home health aide, decent and overworked, finally got off her call and signed the delivery slip. "Sorry about that. It's been a morning. Mr. Whitfield's son wants the new therapy scheduled finalized by Friday, and nobody can agree on anything." She said it lightly, the way people say things about employers they like, but don't fully trust the family dynamics of. "New therapy?" Daniel asked before he could stop himself. "Passive range of motion, mostly. Keeps him from stiffening up. Same thing for years now." Priya shrugged. "Not that it's changed anything." Daniel nodded, said nothing else, and left. He did not look back at the man by the window. He told himself the foot meant nothing. He told himself this 3 more times before he reached the van, which was, he would later admit, 3 times too many for something that meant nothing. Sophie's teacher called back on his lunch break.
It wasn't bad news exactly. Sophie had told her class during a "What does your parent do?" exercise that her father used to heal people's bodies, and now he brought them milk. And another child had laughed, and Sophie had gone very quiet for the rest of the day and hadn't spoken since. Ms. Doyle wanted Daniel to know, gently, that Sophie seemed to be carrying something about it. Daniel sat in the van in the market parking lot for 4 full minutes before he started the engine again. He was still thinking about the man's foot. He went back to Ash Grove Hill 3 days later, not delivering, off the clock, telling himself it was a wrong turn on a walk with Sophie that somehow ended 2 miles from their apartment on a hill they had no reason to be on. Sophie asked whose house it was. Daniel said he wasn't sure. He was looking at the window with the half-drawn curtain when Arthur Whitfield, wheeling himself slowly along the front path with Priya trailing a few feet behind for safety, spotted him.
"You again," Arthur said, not unfriendly, curious, in the flat way of a man unused to curiosity. "Sorry, we were just—" Daniel gestured vaguely at Sophie, at the world, at the flimsy nothing of his excuse. "You looked at my foot again, just now, from the sidewalk." Sophie looked between the two men with the frank interest of an 8-year-old who has decided grown-ups are more interesting than she'd been led to believe. "Daddy does that," she said helpfully. "He looks at how people walk. He used to fix people's bodies for a job." Arthur Whitfield's eyes moved to Daniel with new and undivided attention. "Used to." "It's not what I do anymore," Daniel said, too fast. "Why not?" Nobody had asked him that so directly in 3 years. Most people, sensing the wound, walked around it. Arthur Whitfield, who had spent 12 years being talked around instead of talked to, apparently had no patience left for that kind of mercy. "It's complicated," Daniel said. "I have time," Arthur said, gesturing at the chair, at his own stillness, with something that might have been the driest joke Daniel had heard in years. "More than most people I know." Daniel didn't answer that day, but he came back the following week, once and then again, telling himself each time it was the last, that he was only being polite to a customer, that Sophie liked the little garden by the gate. Arthur Whitfield began, without ever quite admitting it, to expect him. It was on the 4th visit that Arthur asked the question that changed everything. "My son's physical therapist says my case is closed, has been for years. Passive motion, no active recovery expected, full stop, in writing, from 3 different specialists." He watched Daniel's face carefully as he said it. "You keep looking at my foot like the specialists are wrong." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, against every rule he had built his new life around, he told the truth. "I think there might be intact nerve pathway below the injury site. The way your foot turns when you shift weight, that's not spasm, that's voluntary signal trying to get through. It's subtle, it could be nothing. It could also mean your case was never as closed as everyone decided it was." Arthur Whitfield sat with that for a long time, the wind moving the half-drawn curtain visible through the window behind him, and said very quietly, "Nobody has told me anything that specific in 12 years. That was the moment the story stopped being a delivery route and became something neither man could walk back from. What Daniel didn't know yet, what he would learn only after the cost of knowing became unbearably clear, was that the new therapy schedule Priya had mentioned wasn't about helping Arthur Whitfield recover. It was about closing the file for good. Arthur's son, Marcus, had run Whitfield Furniture as CEO for 11 years under a power of attorney arrangement drawn up after his accident, an arrangement that only held as long as Arthur remained, on paper, permanently and totally incapacitated.
Marcus had spent 2 years quietly steering the company toward a sale that would net him personally more money than Arthur had made in 30 decades of building it. A sale that required a clean, uncomplicated, undisputed medical record. A father who might, even theoretically, recover enough to reclaim decision-making authority was not a variable Marcus could afford. The new therapy schedule Priya had mentioned wasn't more care. It was a new specialist, hand-picked by Marcus, whose job was to write the words "no further improvement expected" into a permanent, unappealable record before the sale closed. Daniel began coming twice a week, always after his route, always in his own clothes, always calling it just talking. He asked Arthur small, careful questions about sensation, about temperature, about the exact quality of numbness in different areas, the questions of a clinician who had once been very good at his job and was, despite every promise he'd made himself, still very good at his job. He didn't touch Arthur's legs. He didn't prescribe anything. He didn't have a license active enough to legally treat anyone, and he knew it. And some nights he lay awake telling himself he was only a friend asking questions, and some nights he didn't believe himself at all. It was Priya who eventually pushed things forward, not Daniel. She had watched Arthur's face change on the days Daniel visited. Color in it, focus, a version of a man she'd only seen in old photographs on the mantel. She mentioned Daniel once in front of Arthur's daughter. Dr. Elena Whitfield was Arthur's oldest child, chief of trauma surgery at Fairhaven Memorial, 2 counties over, a woman who had spent her career learning to not hope for things medicine couldn't promise. She flew in on 11 hours' notice when Priya called her, not because she believed a delivery driver had found something 3 specialists missed, but because her father sounded like a man again instead of a diagnosis, and she needed to see that with her own eyes. She met Daniel in the kitchen where he'd once left 3 crates of groceries. She did not shake his hand. "My father says you think his injury might not be complete," she said. "I want to know exactly why you think that, in clinical terms, right now, before you say another word to him."
Daniel gave it to her straight. The foot rotation, the temperature discrepancies Arthur had described, the specific dermatome pattern that didn't match the imaging Arthur had described 12 years ago. Elena listened with her arms crossed and her face giving away nothing, the posture of a surgeon who had heard 100 family members insist 100 impossible things. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's not nothing. That's actually a fairly specific clinical observation." She looked at him harder. "Who were you before you were delivering groceries?" "Nobody important," Daniel said. "I don't believe that," Elena said. "Nobody who isn't trained talks about dermatomes like that." Marcus Whitfield found out his father had a delivery boy physical therapist 3 weeks later from Priya's shift notes, which he read the way he read everything, for liability. He arrived at the house that evening in a suit that clearly came straight from a boardroom, and the warmth that had begun, slowly, to return to that house went cold the moment he walked in. "Get out," he told Daniel, in front of Arthur. "You have no license, no authorization, and no business anywhere near my father's medical situation. Do you understand what you've done? You've given a paralyzed 71-year-old man false hope based on watching his foot twitch." "I never promised him anything," Daniel said quietly. "You didn't have to. Look at him." Marcus gestured at his father, whose jaw was set in a way Daniel had come to recognize as Arthur Whitfield holding back something enormous. Arthur's voice, when it came, was steady. "It's my hunch too, Marcus. I've felt it. Every day for years, and every doctor you hired told me I was imagining it." "Because you were," Marcus said, and something in his voice cracked just slightly, Just enough for Daniel, trained for years to read what a body says when words won't, to notice it and file it away without understanding yet what it meant. Marcus turned back to Daniel. "You're done here, and I'm calling Fenwick Market tomorrow morning to make sure you're done there, too." He did. By 9 the next morning, Daniel's manager called him in, apologetic and embarrassed, holding a printed email from a lawyer representing Whitfield Furniture that used words like unlicensed medical interference and reputational liability and termination effective immediately. Fenwick Market let him go by 10 a.m. A local gossip page picked up the story from an anonymous tip by that evening. Grocery delivery man posed as a therapist to wealthy paralyzed businessman, with a photo of Daniel loading his van that made him look furtive instead of tired. Comments piled up fast and cruel. People he'd delivered to for years left one-star reviews on the store's page, calling him a predator, a con man, a fraud playing doctor for attention. Someone at Sophie's school saw the article. By Friday, Sophie came home saying a boy had called her dad a liar in front of the whole cafeteria, and this time she didn't just go quiet. She cried in the car the whole way home, and Daniel had to pull over twice because his hands weren't steady enough to drive.
That night, sitting in the dark of their small kitchen with Sophie finally asleep, Daniel came closer than he had in 3 years to deciding he'd been wrong to ever look at a stranger's foot again. He thought about Mara. He thought about the 12-session form. He thought bitterly that the pattern of his life seemed to be that trying to help people cost him everything, twice now, and maybe the lesson he was supposed to learn was simply to stop. He didn't get the chance to fully surrender to that thought because at 11:40 p.m. his phone rang, and it was Elena Whitfield. "My father hasn't eaten in 2 days," she said, no preamble. "He won't talk to Marcus. He keeps asking about you. I looked into your record, Daniel, your actual record, not the gossip page. You were suspended from clinical practice not for incompetence, for refusing to falsify a discharge form. There's an entire malpractice board hearing transcript with your name on it, and you were right in it, and it cost you your marriage's last good years and probably your wife's life. And nobody in this family bothered to check that before Marcus destroyed your job over a photo of you carrying groceries." Daniel sat very still, phone pressed hard to his ear, unable to speak. "Elena wants me to come back. Not quietly this time. I want to bring in an independent neurologist, someone with no connection to this family or this company. And I want you in the room, and I want to find out if you're right, on the record, where Marcus can't spin it into a scandal about a delivery driver playing pretend." "Why would you do that for me? You don't know me." "I'm doing it for my father," Elena said. "But I've read the transcript, Daniel. I know exactly what kind of man loses everything rather than sign something false. That's not a con man. That's the rarest thing I've met in a decade in this profession. Someone who tells the truth when it costs him." The independent evaluation took place 11 days later in a converted sunroom at the back of the Whitfield house, with a neurologist named Dr. Feld, who had flown in from Chicago specifically because she had no history with the family, the company, or the sale Marcus was still quietly trying to push through. Daniel was present, at Arthur's insistence, though he said almost nothing. He had learned, finally, the difference between observing and overstepping. And he stood at the edge of the room with his hands folded, watching a professional do carefully, with proper authority and proper tools, the thing he had only been able to notice from a doorway.
Dr. Feld's nerve conduction studies took 4 hours. Her conclusion, delivered flatly and without drama, because that was simply how she spoke, was this: Arthur Whitfield's injury, while severe, had never been the complete transection recorded in his original chart. A significant portion of signal pathway remained intact below the injury site. Rare, easy to miss with the right provocative testing, but real and very likely recoverable to some meaningful degree with an aggressive, properly supervised active rehabilitation program, something Arthur Whitfield had never once been offered in 12 years of passive motion maintenance therapy. Why, Elena asked, very quietly, looking at the imaging, would 3 separate specialists over 12 years all miss this? Dr. Feld was blunt. Either they didn't run the provocative tests that would have caught it, or someone made sure they didn't need to. It was Priya, finally, who broke the last piece of it open, sitting in Elena's kitchen 2 nights later with a folder she'd kept 8 months because something about it had never sat right with her. Marcus had commissioned the most recent closing specialist himself, outside the normal referral system, and had personally selected which imaging and which test results were sent to him. Priya had noticed the specialist's report referenced test results that, according to her own care logs, had never actually been performed on Arthur at all. She'd assumed it was a clerical error. It wasn't. It was a fabricated closing report, ordered and paid for privately by Marcus, timed to finalize 2 weeks before the company sale, designed to make his father's incapacity permanent and unchallengeable on paper before anyone thought to look closely enough to ask why. Elena took the folder to the family's estate attorney the next morning, not the company's, someone with no financial stake in the sale going through. Within a week, the fabricated report had triggered a formal review by the state medical board, and the pending sale of Whitfield furniture was frozen pending an independent audit of Arthur's decision-making capacity and the power of attorney arrangement that had governed the company for over a decade. Marcus did not go to prison. Fraud of this particular carefully bloodless kind rarely produces headlines that dramatic, and Arthur, in the end, chose not to pursue criminal charges against his own son, a decision that cost him something visible on his face every time he made it, but a decision that was his to make, finally, as a man whose competency could no longer be legally questioned. What Marcus lost was the company, the power of attorney, and any illusion in the small circle of people who mattered to Arthur that his motives were ever what he claimed. There was no press conference. Arthur insisted on that, and Elena backed him, and Daniel, who had never once wanted an audience, was quietly grateful. Fenwick Market rehired Daniel with a written apology and back pay he didn't ask for, but didn't refuse either, since Sophie needed new shoes regardless of how the story ended. The gossip page that had run the original story ran a follow-up 2 paragraphs long, buried, correcting almost nothing, the way these things usually go. But by then it didn't matter to Daniel the way it once would have. He had stopped needing strangers on the internet to understand what had happened in that sunroom.
The rehabilitation program began in early spring. It was slow. Dr. Feld was clear from the start that recoverable did not mean guaranteed, and certainly did not mean fast. And Daniel, working now under proper supervision, and a renewed, formally reinstated license Elena had personally helped him fight to restore, treated every session like it might be the last good one, because that was the only way he knew how to work anymore. Arthur Whitfield did not walk in a week or a month. He regained, first, sensation in a toe he hadn't felt in over a decade, and cried about it alone in his room the first night, and told no one for 3 days.
17 years to the week after the mezzanine fall that had ended, according to every doctor but one delivery driver, any hope of him ever standing again, Arthur Whitfield stood. There was no crowd. Arthur had asked specifically that there be no crowd, no reporters, no company employees, no gala, nothing that turned the truest moment of his life back into a performance for people who hadn't earned the right to witness it. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the same sunroom where Dr. Feld had first found the truth, with a walker positioned in front of him, Elena on one side with her hand hovering an inch from his elbow and not touching it, and Daniel on the other, close enough to catch him and far enough to let him try. Arthur Whitfield pushed himself up out of the chair he had lived in for 17 years, arms shaking, breath ragged, and stood. He did not say anything grand. He looked for a long moment at Daniel, at the man who had once carried 3 crates of soft food into his kitchen and lingered too long looking at his foot, and he said only, "You saw me," before anyone else bothered to look. Daniel's throat was too tight to answer with words, so he didn't try to. Sophie was there that day, sitting cross-legged on the sunroom with a coloring book she wasn't really using because Elena had insisted she come, had said a moment like this deserved to be witnessed by someone who'd never once doubted her father. When Arthur Whitfield took his first unsteady, walker-braced step in 17 years, it was Sophie who broke the silence, not with applause, but with a small, matter-of-fact voice that made every adult in the room go quiet. "See," she said to no one in particular, "I told that boy at school my dad still fixes people." Arthur Whitfield, standing for the first time in 17 years, laughed, a short, cracked, disbelieving sound, and it was, everyone agreed later, the best sound any of them had heard in a long time. 2 years after that Tuesday, there is a small, unremarkable plaque bolted to the inside of the sunroom doorframe at the Whitfield house, low enough that a child could read it. It doesn't mention the company, or the fraud, or the specialists, or the sale that never happened. It says only, "This room is where someone finally looked closely enough to ask the right question." Daniel still delivers groceries 3 mornings a week, not because he has to anymore, but because he says the quiet drive before sunrise is where he does his best thinking, and because Fenwick Market's owner never once, in the end, forgot who had really been in the wrong. The other 4 days he treats patients again, properly licensed, mostly the kind of cases other therapists call too complicated to bother with. Arthur Whitfield walks with a cane now, slowly, deliberately, and every single morning, without fail, he walks himself the length of his own driveway to collect the newspaper, because for 17 years someone else had to bring it to him, and some mornings a man just wants to be the one who does the small thing himself.